I'll pretend you're a room full of people.
I'll try to get as much questions in as a room full of people.
We appreciate it.
We're ready when you are.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here. I'm Bryan Evans, and I work as a professor of public administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. I was once told that a key consideration for any decision made by Premier Ford and his government is simply, will anyone care? The book that we have published and is now available is really a nudge to everyone to care, particularly as we enter an election. We have called the book Against the People, How Ford Nation is Dismantling Ontario. And that is why we need to care. The public programs and publicly funded institutions built over decades are in danger. They are not in danger due to government neglect, but rather a strategy to take them apart. Here in Ontario, we have built over generations again a significant level of public wealth. By that, I'm referring to things like public education, our public colleges, our public universities, our public healthcare, local government infrastructure, and much more. Our parks, our provincial parks, the green belt. And then if we think about long-term care, community centers, hockey and curling arenas, we have an incredible amount of public wealth. Our public wealth is significant, and the wealthy want it. Not for the many, but the few. We can think of it as another gold rush about to begin. Getting it done might be a catchy slogan, but the book takes a deep dive in asking about getting it done, sure, but for whom? The book is a modest effort at profiling government action and inaction and proposing real solutions to complicated problems. There are many key takeaways that we find in every page of the book. A few I'll outline. Obviously, we all know that food and housing is becoming unaffordable. Housing alone between 2021 and 24 increased in cost by 23%. Much is said about how our government and how much they are investing in public programs like healthcare, like education, but yet per capita, each program puts Ontario at the bottom of all 10 provinces, at the very bottom. 1 in 10 people in Ontario, in Toronto, routinely visit a food bank. Economic inequality and polarization is running rampant. Toronto is home to over 100,000 people with a net worth of $1 million to $99 million. There are more than 190 individuals worth over 100 million living in Toronto. And Toronto is home to 18 billionaires. We hear a lot about Russian oligarchs, even American oligarchs, but we have oligarchs in Ontario as well. And they are heard. That type of economic inequality is leading to serious social and economic distortions we chronicle in the book. Former progressive conservative governments between 1943 and 1985 worked and built, albeit unevenly, an Ontario which is socially and economically more inclusive. They used the power of government to build for the many, not the few. That's why they agreed that Ontario should join Medicare, applied regulations to protect land, air, water, and working people. They even brought in rent control in 1975, reluctantly, but it happened. The book gives profile to how our public wealth is being hollowed out, eroded, and given away. It's about how our government is not getting it done for the people. I'm going to call on my colleague, Fanelli Renega, to take the podium and talk a little bit about his chapter.
Thank you, Bryan. Excuse me. Good morning. My name is Fanelli Renega, and I'm a researcher with QP National. Premier Ford's transparent attempt to secure another term in office by distracting Ontarians from his government's shortcomings and scapegoating our neighboring Our neighbours to the south is concerning. This government is for the corporations and by the corporations, so it's crucial to reflect on the government's record and consider what another term might mean for Ontario. Last October, Premier Ford stated that, quote, life is better in Ontario than 6 years ago. While that may be true for a select few, it's certainly not the case for most Ontarians. The reality is that the majority of people in Ontario are navigating deep economic and social uncertainty, which has only grown under Ford's leadership. Here's a snapshot of some of the data that defines the lives of the average Ontarian. Public services are being systematically undermined. When we factor in for inflation and population growth, by 2026, the government plans to spend $1,390 less per person on public services compared to 2020, which is a 10.3% decline. Ontario has the lowest per person revenue and public service spending amongst all provinces. For the province to match just the provincial average, we would need to invest an additional $42 billion. Our healthcare is in crisis, with 1 in 7 without a family doctor, which is projected to rise to 1 in 4 next year. Currently, the province is short 2,000 doctors, and the government attempted to conceal an impending shortage of 33,000 nurses and 55,000 personal support workers. While this may sound like just statistics, this has real life and death consequences. Last year alone, an estimated 11,000 people died waiting for surgeries and diagnostic scans. The effective marginal tax rate for a family with 2 young children earning $50,000 is nearly 75%, while the same family earning $250,000 pays less than 50%. The predictable consequences of such an unfair system is that Ontario has the worst income inequality of any province. These are not signs of a better life for the majority of Ontarians. So who is Premier Ford talking about when he says life is better? Well, the numbers suggest that salaries for staff in the Premier's office have increased by 136%, and wages for Conservative cabinet members have risen 72% by 2018. Corporations are thriving with nearly $10 billion in annual tax breaks and subsidies. On top of that, 12 pieces of legislation have passed to reduce corporate regulation, saving businesses an additional $1.2 billion. From 2019 to 2020, the richest 20% of households saw their incomes grow by 13%, while the rest of Ontarians saw just a 5% increase. And what about the $200 check that is arriving in mailboxes right now? It's a convenient election stunt, but let's put it into perspective. That $200 pales in comparison to the $385 that each Ontarian is losing in public services this year alone. The truth is clear. Doug Ford's claim that life is better in Ontario doesn't hold water, except for a select few. As we look ahead, we must ask ourselves, can we afford another 4 years of this? For the vast majority of Ontarians, the answer is no. Thank you. Let me pass it on to my colleague, Kathy.
Good morning. My name is Kathy Laird. I am a retired human rights lawyer and adjudicator and a member of Tribunal Watch Ontario, an advocacy group that fights for fair, accessible and timely justice at Ontario's tribunals. When the Ford government took office, it moved quickly, in its first term, it moved quickly to put its stamp on several Ontario tribunals, stripping them of their expertise, replacing experienced adjudicators, and replacing their leadership, often with Tory insiders. It created Tribunals Ontario and moved key tribunals under its new leadership. A former federal Tory candidate with no experience in a public service government agency and no experience in the areas of law or the communities that his agency was serving, including child welfare, social assistance, housing law, discrimination law. Today, the result has been disastrous for Ontarians who need to go to some of Ontario's key tribunals and busiest tribunals, the Landlord and Tenant Board, the Human Rights Tribunal, or the License Appeal Tribunal, which hears motor vehicle injury claims against insurance companies. Here's what it looks like today. A tenant used to get a hearing within 40 days after filing at the Landlord and Tenant Board in 2018. In 2024, the average wait was 277 days. The Landlord and Tenant Board has developed a massive backlog, peaking at 53,000 in 2024, as compared to only 16,000 before the Ford government changed the leadership. And this backlog developed despite a very significant drop in the number of incoming cases coming in during the pandemic year. Over 50,000 fewer cases as it developed a backlog of 53,000. At the Human Rights Tribunal, 93% of final decisions now are dismissals without a hearing, mostly of cases that have been stuck in the tribunal's backlog for years. Rigid and onerous new filing requirements are now pushing human rights claimants out of the system. The tribunal requires complex legal submissions at several stages of the process, but 80% of the claimants don't have lawyers, resulting in a threefold increase in the number of claimants that abandon their claims, usually, again, after years of waiting for a hearing. The HRTO, the Human Rights Tribunal, is issuing less than half the number of full discrimination decisions today as it did before the Ford government brought in its own leadership. Justice delayed is justice denied. Today, for example, if you experience sexual harassment at work and you are lucky enough to be granted a hearing, you can expect to wait 4 to 10 years for the tribunal to issue a decision in your case. The Human Rights Legal Support Center, which was established to provide legal assistance to human rights claimants who don't have a lawyer, and 80% of human rights claimants don't have a lawyer. The center has been forced to cut its legal staff in half because the Ford government has frozen funding at 2008 levels. At the Landlord and Tenant Board and the Human Rights Tribunal, in-person hearings in your own community died under the current leadership. They've been replaced by electronic hearings, which work for some people, but they don't work for people who lack adequate access to computers or the internet. And at the Landlord and Tenant Board, where most cases, the vast majority are rent arrears, and low-income tenants are frequent respondents, the Landlord and Tenant Board held over 74,000 hearings last year, but only 25 were in person. Sometimes tenants can only connect to their hearing by telephone, putting them at a disadvantage compared to landlords who participate in a Zoom hearing room. The elimination of in-person hearings, touted by the leadership as being modern and efficient, has not produced a streamlined and more timely process. In fact, it actually takes twice as many adjudicators today to handle the same volume of cases as when the cases were heard in person, partly because you don't get the settlements that you get when people are face-to-face in a hearing room. There were only 4 in-person hearings, human rights hearing last year in Ontario. The very few hearings that did take place, whether electronically or the 4 that happened in person, were of claims that had been filed many years earlier. There were claims from 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. These cases were heard in 2023 or 24. So there's nothing fair, efficient, user-friendly, or timely about any of this. I want to also say a couple of things about the Licensed Appeal Tribunal. That's an agency that hears claims against insurance companies when people are injured in a motor vehicle accident. The LAT, as it's called, was moved into Tribunals Ontario by the Ford government. A process that was supposed to empower self-represented accident victims has failed miserably. Out of the last 4,500 decisions, only 33 were successful claims by self-represented parties. And the success rate for injury claims against insurance companies has now fallen from 33% to 10%. In-person hearings have also been eliminated. Last year, there was only 1 in-person hearing, and there were over 33,000 electronic hearings. So the bottom line, I guess, is this. You don't want to be a tenant or a landlord in Ontario who needs help in resolving a dispute. You don't want to be a human rights claimant, someone who may have experienced discrimination in their workplace or sexual harassment because of race, disability, gender, pregnancy, or any other ground of discrimination. And you don't want to be injured in a car accident because if your insurance company doesn't pay up, the process that you face is insurmountable unless you can afford a lawyer. If you find yourself in any of these situations, there's no accessible, timely, or fair process for you in Ontario today. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Maria Rio, and I have worked in the nonprofit sector for over 12 years. I'm here to speak to you about the crisis in the nonprofit sector. There are hundreds of thousands of Ontarians turning to food banks, not out of choice, but out of desperation. Last year, this number surpassed 1 million. Many are drowning in debt, trapped by payday loans, and dependent on charity. This suffering is not accidental or inevitable. It is a direct result of government failure and neglect. Under Ford's leadership, Ontario's most vulnerable have been abandoned. Here are the facts. The minimum wage in Ontario is $17.20 an hour, just over $33,500 a year before taxes. In Toronto, that's $5,000 below the disposable income needed to meet Canada's official poverty line. This is unacceptable. According to the Ontario Living Wage Network, the true cost of living in the GTA is $26 an hour, or over $50,000 a year. That leaves minimum wage workers facing a $17,200 gap between what they earn and what they need to survive. Let me be clear. 70% of minimum wage workers are adults. They're not teenagers. They are our neighbors, our parents, and frontline workers. Shockingly, 2/3 of food insecure households in Canada rely primarily on wages, highlighting the strong link between low-wage work and food insecurity. Social assistance is even more damning. A single person on ODSP receives just $1,308 a month, less than $16,000 a year. On Ontario Works, it's even more disgraceful, $733 a month or $8,796 a year. In Toronto, this leaves people $12,000 to $19,000 below Ontario's deep poverty line. Even by its own standards, the provincial government is failing to provide a livable income. This is not assistance, it is a sentence to poverty. And Ford's approach, propping up piecemeal solutions when he has all the power to create systemic change. He visits the Daily Bread Food Bank and asks the public to give. Yet 36% of Ontario nonprofits providing free food now have long wait lists. They're overwhelmed, they're turning people away, and they're closing their doors. Ford's poverty reduction strategy claims that getting people into the workforce will solve poverty. But people are already working full-time and still can't afford to live. Work isn't a ticket out of poverty when wages are this low and inflation is this high. Poverty in Ontario isn't inevitable. It's a policy choice, and Doug Ford has chosen to let it worsen. This government is failing us. Ford's policies and his lack of urgent action are deepening poverty, eroding dignity, and forcing families to choose between food and shelter. We deserve better. We deserve a government that puts people over profit. But here's the good news. We have power. We have a choice. In this next election, we can choose to reject Ford's path of neglect. We can demand a government that fights for real systemic solutions, living wages, meaningful social supports, and policies that prioritize the people of Ontario. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. My name is Carlo Fanelli. I'm an associate professor of work and labor studies at York University and the interim director of the Global Labor Research Center, also at York University. So at the core of this book is the question, are Ontarians better off today than when the Ford government came to power nearly 7 years ago? In many cases, whether looking at healthcare, education, social supports, labor market outcomes, or even personal finances, the answer is unequivocally no. Ontario sits dead last among the provinces and among its provincial counterparts when it comes to operating supports for post-secondary education, and some 35% below the Canadian student average. As a result, colleges and universities across Ontario have resorted to a record number of program closures, staff and faculty layoffs, while students bear the brunt of larger classroom sizes and fewer supports. The same is true for our elementary and secondary school boards, where had investments grown equal to Ontario's population growth, there would be an additional 5,000 frontline classroom educators. Instead, inflation-adjusted spending is down some 9%, as Ontario's school board repair backlog has grown by an additional $2 billion in the time since the Ford government took office. Ontario Disability Support Program rates, in real terms, have been frozen at 2018 levels, while inflation-adjusted social assistance rates are lower today than when the last Conservative government was in power more than 20 years ago. Since 2018, the number of Ontarians with developmental disabilities waiting for supportive housing has grown by 10,000 persons. 40% of Ontarians today, the highest on record and the most of any province, report living in a household that is experiencing financial hardship and say they are considering leaving the province due to low wages, rising debt loads, and unaffordable food and housing costs. This is not surprising considering that less than 40% of the more than $36 million owed to workers as a result of employment law violations have been recovered, while Ministry of Labour inspections are down some 70% since the Ford government took office. When it comes to employment relationships, the Ford government has made it more difficult to organize unions in the home care, building trades, and temporary help sectors, made it easier to decertify unions, reduced the amount of personal emergency leave days for workers, and ended paid sick days. Government legislation has reduced the real wages of more than 1 million Ontario workers during a time of record inflation. This was followed up by Bill 115, which explicitly violated fundamental rights and freedoms protected under the Charter to impose a contract on 55,000 education workers across the province. It is important to note that this was only the second time in Ontario's history that the notwithstanding clause was used, the first also by the Ford government. Premier Ford has since threatened to use it on 2 other occasions, most recently to criminalize homelessness. That the Ford government has on repeated occasions done what no other Ontario government or premier before him has dared to do in removing constitutionally protected rights and freedoms should not be lost on Ontarians. If Ontario continues down this path, the scale and immediacy of this social and economic crisis will likely leave a generational scar. Thank you for your time. There are a number of copies available of the book, a number of contributors, and if you're interested in reading more about this, we have the copies there. We're happy to take questions as well as put you in touch with the more than 20 contributors that contributed to this record on the Ford government. Thank you.
That's a question. You can take it, and if anyone else wants to jump up. And I just, looking at some of the stuff John Clark writes in the last chapter, thinking about the history and the comparisons to the Mike Harris years, and how we haven't seen that kind of big protest. There were some protests early in the Ford time, but nothing that compares to the days of action and the stuff from the 90s. And I wonder what do you think accounts for that? Why haven't we seen more? We almost saw a bit of it. You just mentioned Bill 15 there. There was a threat of a potential for a general strike or something. There was going to be a big coordinated labor movement action to strike back against the notwithstanding clause, but we haven't seen anything like that really, especially in the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to invite my colleagues and contributors who are up here to join on stage in case they'd like and to say anything else. But I think part of the issue that there has been no united front, let's say, similar to the days of action in a sense, is that there's a crisis of political imagination and of organization in the labor movement. The labor movement is not a monolith. Some workers are organized but not in unions, and some workers are in unions but not organized. And part of this is history has historical precedents going back to the damage done to Ontario's manufacturing and unionized sectors throughout the 80s and 90s, and continuing since the 2000s. We've seen declining union rates, particularly in the private sector, which today have stabilized around 15-16%, though they've remained buoyant in the public sector. Part of the other issue is that we've seen repeated intrusions against labor rights, irrespective of the government in power. And this has created some hesitancy for unions and non-unionized workers to hold on to what they've got in the fear that it might be even more taken away. We've seen some of these challenges and the way that workers have responded to them in the United States as far as kind of turn towards economic nationalism. And in the absence of alternatives, there's fears that this might happen as well in the Ontario context. But I'm sure others have other things to say as well.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Really good point that you bring up. I worked in the Ontario government in that period, 95 to 99, the Labour Department in particular. And I had a friend of mine call me one day who worked across the street from the legislature. He said, "You know what? I'm watching a cavalry charge." And it was John Clark's organization, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, holding a large demo on the North Lawn. Oh, no, North Lawn? South Lawn. And like, who would have thought that there would be a cavalry charge? But there we had it. 1995 and that entire period, we've come a long way. And we've come a long way in terms of the things that Carlo mentioned and alluded to, but part of which being that you'll recall the days of action. There were 250,000 people in downtown Toronto that one weekend in 95, 96, I can't remember which. And that organizational capacity, that mobilization, did not and maybe could not continue. And over the intervening 25 to 28 years, we've watched a kind of general demobilization, which is what you're picking up on. And so we're at a point now where, the broad kind of mobilizations we watched at the beginning of the common sense revolution haven't happened. Carlo mentioned the trade unions have, particularly in the private sector, lower membership. The kind of political, and I'd even call it cultural work that maybe needed to be carried on from that point on didn't happen. And so we're kind of beginning again, is what I would add.
So who is this book for? It seems like it's got lots of tidbits for like maybe journalists to look at, but are you really expecting like the average Ontarian to read this thing before voting?
Maybe we can chat a little bit about this as co-editors. I mean, this book is essentially aimed at a general readership interested in politics, interested in the forward record over the last 7 odd years. It's not a scholarly initiative. Well, it is scholarly, but not academic in the sense that it's supported by the empirical evidence. I mean, we take no particular views to the sectors we examine other than to see where the evidence leads us. And in most cases, whether it's healthcare, education, social services spending, affordability, the record 7 years later is one of decreasing educational opportunities, ill health, longer wait times. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate how much the number of Ontarians without a family doctor, or the number of hospital beds that have been reduced by 2,000 in the 7 years has impacted the quality of healthcare and education and social services. So we're hoping that because the articles are written in a short, accessible, even punchy way, that people will be interested in picking this up and sharing it with others.
Yeah. It's a really good point. Like we have no expectation that 1 million people are going to buy the book and read it, or even 500,000. It's targeted to, as Carlo said, people who are interested in the kind of issues that we talk about. And we're hoping that people like yourself, opinion leaders, opinion shapers, will pick it up, leaf through it, and be reminded of where we have been and where we're at in the current moment. We live in a culture which has become increasingly apolitical. People don't pay attention. They're consumed with getting through each and every day. And consequently, we forget what might be going on all around us. And the point I made in my remarks is simply, I've been around long enough and working in government. In fact, I worked here at the legislature back in the mid-1980s, to be able to reflect on personally about where we were and where we are going. And the institutions that are being eroded, hollowed out, dismantled, won't be rebuilt. Once they're gone, they're gone.
Can we hear a little bit about how this book came together? How long has it been in the works? And I guess I understand that you guys had different people write different sections. So you just what kind of research went into it? Where did you find the data? That sort of thing.
Sure. Well, this book brings together contributions from more than 20 experts in their respective fields. We have human rights lawyers, leaders in the NGO sector, economists, academics, educators at the elementary and secondary school level, We have people who have been involved in labor union and non-unionized workers movements in community-based organizations. So this book is really written by the on-the-ground experts. The data compiles everything from government records to policy reports, to academic literature, to interview data, media. So it really tries to become, or brings together kind of one-stop shop in a sense, where you can find all the most recent data on what's been happening to Ontario over the last 7 years. But we're clear in our expectations that this is not the last word, but rather part of an ongoing discussion with others that we hope they'll start to ask questions about things that the book doesn't cover. And in many ways, the people that we have here can best speak to how their chapters reflect what's been happening in Ontario over the last 7 years.
Yeah, just to add to that, a lot of this data is available. However, there's streams of information. It gets buried very quickly by this government. So to be able to pick out some of this data, put it in an accessible format, appreciate the narrative that sort of describes the government over the last 6 years, I think is what's well done in the book. Any deep dive or any further questions, I'd be happy to ask and provide you with a lot more of a deeper dive, particularly around the sort of the economic and finances side of the last 6 years.
Where can people get this book? Is it in stores? Do you have to order online?
The book is available at Fernwood Publishing. It's also available at www.againstthepeople.ca, where there's a link they can order directly. It's available in your local bookstores. And we encourage you to come out to the book's official launch on February 18th at the Center for Social Innovation in downtown Toronto at 7 p.m., as well as an event on March 20th at the Global Labor Research Center at York University from 2:30 to 4:30 p.m.
And not quite on your point, but we're already at a point that the book has barely been out, and we're already having to do a second run, which is, kind of atypical or unusual.
I think maybe I'll add something about your question about where the data is available. An example would be the annual report of Tribunals Ontario. If you read the annual report, it says in the Executive Chair's message that Tribunals Ontario and its tribunals are well on the way to becoming recognized as the best tribunals in North America. But when you actually look at the data, the picture is completely different. Last year, the backlog of 53,000 cases at the Landlord and Tenant Board was only reduced by 27 cases. In order to make it look better, the annual report brings in data from the current fiscal year, which is kind of deceptive and sets up a false percentage for the increase in incoming cases. So I think there is a tendency, someone else has mentioned it, for this government to gloss over the bad stuff and put forward data that can be quite misleading. And I find that in particular in the tribunal sector and with Tribunals Ontario. So the messaging in the report is that everything's good and that justice is faster, more accessible, user-friendly, all things that the data actually proves otherwise.
I'm good. Are you good?
Yeah, I'll cover it another time. We can talk about it.
Thank you very much.
All right.